born and brought up in the West Midlands, and when I was a young boy I was very interested in books. I used to read a lot. At secondary school I became very interested in literature, and so I went on to study English literature at Liverpool University quite a long time ago now. So once I got my degree, I kind of drifted into teaching for want of anything else to do. So I taught for a year in the UK, but then I got itchy feet. So I began a career as a teacher of English as a foreign come second language. I've worked over the years in Oman, Spain, Malaysia, Brunei Darussalam, the Emirates, and also Hong Kong. So I'm mainly based in Asia, but I'm pretty well travelled. I first came to Hong Kong in 1991, and I've lived here more or less ever since, although between 2000 and 2004 I was actually working in the Emirates in Dubai. So I'm not teaching anymore, I've kind of retired. What I do now is very little. But I'm interested in natural history and birds, so I do lead nature tours for a tour company in Hong Kong as well as independently freelance. And I also do writing and photography about the natural history of Hong Kong, and I published a few books on that. Going back to my interest in literature, over the years I've written 6 novels, a travel book, my journey to India in the 1980s, and also a few poems as well. Unfortunately, I've got lots and lots of rejection slips from all of those books. None of them were published, apart from a few poems in a few magazines. So, come 2011, I was thinking about it, and of those 6 novels, I thought this one was probably the one that I would was the one, so we say, least deserving of rejection. So I thought, well, I've nothing to lose, so I submitted it to Proverse, and Proverse published it. So at last, one of my novels is in print, and it was accepted by people who didn't know me at all, so that's quite gratifying to know that after all those rejections, there are a few people who do appreciate something I've written. So, the book is called The Village in the Mountains, and it's set in an unnamed European country in the middle of the 20th century, so it's quite vague. The country, the landscape, the religion is clearly based upon Spain. I lived in Spain for 2 years, and so a lot of that is drawn from my experience of the landscape there, although the book itself is not a historical fiction, it's just fiction. So all of the characters are fiction. It's not based on any particular historic events in Spain. So the political background of the novel is that the country has experienced 12 years of authoritarian dictatorship, followed by a new democratic period of 2 years. Unfortunately, now an authoritarian regime is re-establishing itself. And the narrator of the book is a poet and a writer from a well-off family in this country. During the authoritarian period, he fled to England because he was an exile. He was anti-government, and he campaigned, went on marches, campaigned against that government. And in doing so, he estranged himself from his family, who were an influential family in the capital, but the family supported that authoritarian regime. Now, during the new democratic period, the writer returns to the country, but his wife is killed. She's mugged in the capital, and she's actually killed. So the poet becomes disillusioned, disenchanted, he becomes a broken man. So he goes off to the coast in the country and just lives a quiet, very solitary life. But then, what happens then, when the new regime takes over and a man called the Colonel assumes power, he sends his men to take the poet back to the capital. And then in the capital he meets the Colonel, he meets his parents for the first, he meets his father, his mother has died, he meets his father for the first time in many years. But then he is sent into exile in the mountains. So it's a kind of punishment. So the book's in 3 sections. The first section describes the journey from the coast back to the capital city where he meets his father and the Colonel. The second section describes the village where he's taken to in the mountains, to a village called Kago, which is a very primitive place. And originally it was established as a leper colony. And the village, in the second part, it tells you about the relationships he forms with the police chief, who he has to report to every day, with a man called Henry, the school teacher, who befriends him, with the wife of the innkeeper, who he begins an affair with. So that second section is about the relationship between the poet and these people. And we also learn in the second section that the village has a tragic history. It was 8 years before the poet goes there. It was the village, or the mountains near the village, was a site of pilgrimage. There was a statue discovered there called the Dark Virgin, which is a statue of the Virgin Mary. It's a very primitive Catholic country. And during one of the pilgrimages there into the mountains, the statue was kept in a cave, so the pilgrims had to enter the cave to see the statue. And on one day the cave collapsed, killing 400 pilgrims. So there's that tragic background as well. Now that was 8 years prior to the events described in the second section. The first section of the book, the local aristocrat, the local magnate, decides to go back to the cave with an engineer and using new equipment to see if they can penetrate the cave and try and bring back the bodies which are buried by the rubble. And so the people, the police chief, Hubert Deval, the engineer, and the narrator go to explore this cave along with hundreds of other men who are carrying the equipment. And they go higher into the mountains, and the mountains is near the border with a neighbouring country. And later on, things happen to the poet, and the poet has to make a decision whether to remain in exile or whether to leave the country, to go over the border to escape. But basically, that's the basic story. But the book is also about psychological manipulation, because one of the major themes of the book is control by the authoritarian regime. It's a realistic novel, but as the poet narrates things that happened to him on the journey and during his time in the village, there's a vague awareness on his part that something he quite can't put his finger on, that the people, events are not always quite what they seem. And there seems to be a notion that he's actually being manipulated, especially by the police chief in the village. So it's basically, it's just to set the scene. This is when the poet has been taken back to the capital and is put up in a small hotel in one of the major squares next to the Ministry of Education. and he wakes up in the morning and comes out. He hears voices outside and comes out on the balcony to see what is going on. So a woman, I recognized her immediately, moved forward onto the steps that led up to the entrance of the grey building and faced the crowd. The crowd fell silent as she began to speak through a megaphone. I couldn't make out her words clearly, but the vibrancy of the rhetoric, half calculated, half emotional, was tangible on the cold morning air. The performance was typical of Alicia. So was her appearance, the loose sweater, the jeans, the unkempt hair, now with strands of grey in it, all deliberately unfeminine. No one else I knew had such an intense effect on a crowd as she did. The students chanted when she wanted them to chant, became quiet when she lowered her voice, and then, when she had got their full attention, she became suddenly strident in her open condemnation of the Colonel. Those words I heard clearly enough before they were consumed by the different, more ominous sound of boots running, clacking on stone. Alicia's voice froze. The students began to look nervously around them. I could sense their fear as the volume of the noise increased and it became evident what was going to happen. The students didn't run until the soldiers had burst into the square. They simply stood there like confused children in need of guidance. It was Alicia who prompted them into action by screaming through the megaphone. The warning came too late. The soldiers came at them from three corners of the square, their faces covered by dark visors, their batons heavy in their hands. They used the weapons indiscriminately, hitting the students until they fell, beating them as they lay helpless on the ground. The apparent randomness of the attack was, however, illusory. The action had been well planned. The soldiers' arrival from three corners of the square had provided the students with only one exit, along the narrow street that led away from the right-hand side of the ministry. Those students who had not already been caught up in the onslaught took it. I watched as the soldiers in the square didn't pursue them, but formed a line across the end of the street. They waited with military discipline until someone gave a clear order to advance. At first I didn't understand as the soldiers disappeared from view, leaving me staring at the blood-spattered square that was now suddenly full of black military vehicles into which the remaining soldiers were dragging their beaten victims, among them Alicia. The vehicles were driven away. The soldiers stood together in small groups, smoking cigarettes. An unnatural silence descended on the square. This was dispelled by the arrival of more of the black vans, which pulled up and formed a neat line on the cobblestones. The drivers got out, chatted with the soldiers, accepted cigarettes from them. This interlude, almost dreamlike in its ordinariness in comparison with what I had just witnessed, was broken by the return of the soldiers, carrying, dragging, kicking the students who had tried to flee. Many of them had been savagely attacked. Blood streamed from foreheads, limbs hung limply, many were unconscious. Still I didn't understand until I realized that the number of soldiers now swarming into the square had increased considerably. Then I visualized it all. The students taking the only available exit, running scared. The sense of relief when those at the front thought they had evaded the military, forgetful temporarily of the fate of their peers left behind, only to find that relief turn to fear again when they saw the soldiers in front of them blocking their path. Then the students turning in retreat to see the soldiers from the square slowly advancing on them. The realization that they were trapped in a deliberately created funnel from which there was no means of escape. But there was something more than this. I stood on the balcony observing the episode from beginning to end until the last student had been carted away, until the soldier in charge had dismissed his men and only his solitary jeep remained in the square below. Before he got into the jeep, he suddenly looked up at me and smiled. I looked at him coldly, but after he had gone, I felt unnerved. I couldn't rid myself of the notion that the look, the smile, had been premeditated, just as the breaking up of the demonstration had been carefully planned beforehand. The idea seemed absurd, but I felt in some vague way that I was being manipulated, that the fact I had been there to witness the events was not simply a matter of coincidence. After all, I knew Alicia. Okay, that's all I want to read for the moment. But it does establish the vague sense of unease the poet begins to feel that the events are being in some way controlled by the forces that be, and the other events that occur through the book on his journey to the mountains, in the village itself, continue to give that impression that is, in a sense, a victim of forces beyond his control. I must have been interested in exploring the idea of authoritarian dictatorships and freedom, individual freedom. You know, thinking of Spain, obviously back up until the 1970s when Franco ruled it, but that was before I went there. Also probably thinking of, because in the 70s, 80s there were quite a lot of Latin American regimes, Chile, Argentina, which were experiencing the same kind of thing, where, particularly Chile, where democratic elected government was overthrown by Pinochet with the help of the CIA. Yeah. So maybe that was in the air. Quite a few of the books I've written were during gaps in teaching, when I had 5 or 6 months free. So given that freedom of time, I would usually sit down in the morning and work all morning. Type. This goes way back, so it was my first 2 books and the travel book up into the mid-1980s were all typed. So I've still got somewhere this kind of yellow bundle of papers. So I would, I think originally I did actually write it and then type it up. These days with the computer I write. I haven't written anything fiction since 2007, so that's a long time. But in the days of the computer, I would actually just type it directly. So most of the morning, just go through and then go back and revise more slowly. I do a plan with timescales, events that happen, to sort of see it all fits together. A very vague plan, and then of course that plan becomes modified over time, because when I think most writers will say when you write, things change. Otherwise, and if they didn't change, it probably wouldn't be worth doing if you're just writing to a set plan and you know 100% what's happening. Characters do things they're not supposed to. Events begin to change. So then it's a process of modification. I think the characters tend to come and develop during the process of writing. So I'm not just copying a template, copying a plan. Things change, and that's what makes writing interesting. I think that you don't know exactly what's going to happen, how the characters are going to emerge from your own mind. Yes, I think at times once you're not writing, it still goes on in your mind, and during that quiet time you're probably processing it, and that processing may lead to more changes when you go back to writing it. So during the period you're writing the book, it's with you for most of the year, 2 years you're doing it. Most of it's fiction, because there are things which are related to me. My interest in birds and nature is manifested. The poet is interested in birds and nature. I have written in the past poetry, with my poetry in the book is small. So there's that with the poet. But yeah, I was speaking to someone I met a week ago who'd actually read the book. He was a psychiatrist. I wasn't meeting him in a professional capacity. And he was asking me the same thing, how autobiographical was it? And he did say, was your wife named Maria, which is the name of the woman. I think he was joking. So no, I mean, I'm not a radical poet. I didn't come from a rich Spanish background. My wife wasn't murdered. So the politics and most of it is fiction, but with some of my input from my own experiences and the things I've said. Yeah. I suppose from a political perspective, the political viewpoint of the writer is similar to my own, which I suppose is fairly anti-authoritarian, shall we say. I suppose I did write things as a child, as an adult. When I was at university, I started writing one or two things, but probably a bit later than that, most of it from 1980. So I think I remember poems I began writing in 1981, and I think my first novel was 82, 83, up until, say, the last thing I did was 2007. Yeah, there is a reference in the book to Kafka that on the train journey from the capital into the mountains, the poet is actually trying to read a book, and the book he's got is Kafka's The Castle.
Right.
Why I put that in and whether that's meant to point a reference. But having said that, I tried to read The Trial again fairly recently, and I couldn't finish it. I think that Kafka is more dreamlike. It's more like you're actually in a dream. This is not like that. I think this is more realistic than Kafka. There is that the poet does actually miss his country. That's why he goes back. Although he chose exile because in a way he had to, because he would have probably been imprisoned or murdered during the first authoritarian. But then the country is, I suppose, in his blood, and he wants to stay there. He's also fairly broken. He's become disillusioned with his own behavior in the past. He feels that the way he opposed the authoritarian regime was all, and the way he wrote poems and the way he led demonstrations was part of an egotistic show in a way. That he was looking for praise from other people, and so he realized that about himself, that there was in a way an act of bad faith in his actions, so he's disillusioned with that, and so he really wants just to return and be left alone, and he would if he was left alone on the coast, he probably would just stay there, and he has no desire anymore to create any problems or to oppose the government, but the government, well, the colonel actually knows him and knows his family, so it's a personal reason that he's brought back and sent into exile, and it's a personal reason, personal revenge from a kind of basic sociopathic person that is trying to make the poet, well, they're trying to make the poet eventually commit suicide. That's the idea. They're manipulating him to such an extent that is the plan.
That's a very good book, David. Thank you.